everyone. I wanted to continue with part 2 of my science series. So in part 1, we talked about vaccines and the human immune system and why putting somebody who doesn't believe in vaccines in charge of health and human services is a super bad idea. Some things from last time I didn't talk about that I will sort of touch on this time have to do with today's topic, which is why a lot of people are either terrified of or very skeptical of science these days. Coming out of World War II, the last war we really won, clearly, people were sort of in awe and terror of science, but mostly in awe. Scientists were revered. You know, they were our saviors. They developed the bomb, and that ended the war, and at least with Japan. And you know, we were clearly going down the road of a technological society, and scientists were at the lead of the new American power. We were going to basically do everyone else in and become top of the heap through our superior technology and science. And when that was threatened, when Russia actually beat us to space, putting people in space, you know, there was suddenly a hue and cry in the United States, and everybody was saying we have to make our science education even more robust so we can compete with the Russians and they don't defeat us in technology. So there was this time post-World War II for at least into the 1970s and 80s when science was really revered in this country with a sort of wonder and awe. But that trend has certainly reversed itself. And now a lot of people look at science either with a lot of fear or a lot of skepticism or both. Scientists are no longer revered. Science is no longer revered. In fact, a lot of people who promote anti-science or what's called junk science, which is false science, are really more revered now than actual scientists. So I wanted to devote a video talking about that and how that change sort of came to be. But I think Trump's nomination of Robert Kennedy Jr. as head of the Health and Human Services Agency is a reflection of this anti-science or science skepticism. Because let's face it, Robert Kennedy Jr. trucks in anti-science. That's his whole thing. And giving him the benefit of the doubt, I'd like to think that some of his views and attitudes are less due to like his just wanting to be, you know, known and popular to more to ignorance, that he's actually ignorant of a lot of scientific facts. But I don't know, maybe he isn't and just, you know, likes being a person leading the skeptics. So, you know, some people really get off on that. But when Robert Kennedy Jr., for example, talks about, you know, making vaccines voluntary rather than mandatory, he ignores the science of why it's necessary for vaccines to be mandatory for them to work on a population level. And whether he's aware of the science or not, I don't know. I'm guessing over the years people have told him this and maybe he pretends not to believe it or maybe he really doesn't believe it. But facts are facts. And one of the reasons why his plan is so dangerous, let's suppose, even though it sounds good from a libertarian perspective, let's suppose he does that. Let's suppose he pushes the idea that vaccines in the United States should be voluntary and not mandatory. And he says, you know, this is just giving people freedom of choice. We're letting people choose their own destinies. And if they don't like the idea of vaccines, they don't have to get vaccines. They don't have to get their kids vaccinated. And if they don't like, you know, but if they like the idea of vaccines, then they can do it, and it's up to them. And that all sounds good. It sounds like, you know, choice is great, so let's just give people choices. But when it comes to vaccination, if you give people choices, the vaccines don't work. So here's the problem. Vaccines on a population level, I mean, for individuals who get the vaccine, vaccines are protective. But at the population level, if you want to prevent major outbreaks of bad diseases, at least 90 to 95% of the people who are interacting in an area need to be vaccinated. Otherwise, you're going to get outbreaks. This is something called herd immunity. When a bad germ infects somebody and starts reproducing inside them and then tries to spread to another person, how well that germ is able to spread to another person depends on how many people that person who's infected come in contact with, and also how many of the people they come in contact with are themselves protected from the germ. So, for example, if I get infected with a germ that wants to spread from me to somebody else, so it can keep reproducing and keep feeding, and I have contact in a typical week, let's say, with 30 or 40 people. Well, that's 30 or 40 opportunities for the germ to spread. But if all 30 or 40 people I'm in contact with are themselves vaccinated and so protected from the germ, then even with all those close contacts, the germ can't spread and it's going to essentially end with me. But if I'm in contact with 30 or 40 people in a week and I'm infected, and only, let's say, 25 of those people are vaccinated and protected, that means typically I'd be in contact in a week with 10 people who aren't. And statistically, I would pass on the germ to a couple of those people, and then they would pass on to a couple more, and they would pass on to a couple more. And so what you would get is you would get a local outbreak of infection. The only way you can prevent that is either to quarantine me, the infected person, make sure I don't have contact with anyone, or have enough people around me that I'm in contact with who are vaccinated, essentially nearly all of them, where I can't pass the germ to any more than at most one person, and probably less than one on average. That would stop the spread or slow it down enough. So in order to get what's called herd immunity, which is enough people protected from a germ where even if somebody in the group gets infected, unlikely that the germ is going to spread beyond the group. In order to get that herd immunity, 90 to 95% of the people in that group have to be protected. Now, if you make all vaccines voluntary, is it likely that 90 to 95%, let's say, of parents are going to get their kids vaccinated voluntarily, even when they don't have to and it's not necessary to get their kid enrolled in school or whatever? And the answer is no. It's unlikely that you'll get that high a compliance rate with vaccinations if you just give people the choice without any consequences. Or really, with the only consequence is you can get infected. So when Kennedy says, I want to make this voluntary and that just gives people freedom of choice, if you give people freedom of choice, in most cases, you're going to lose herd immunity for some serious diseases. Then, therefore, you're going to get spreading outbreaks of those diseases, and a lot of people are going to die and be made very ill and maybe permanently crippled. So his plan, which sounds libertarian, it sounds like promoting freedom, is actually very anti-science, right? It ignores some basic scientific principles of immunity, and it's going to get a lot of people killed if it's implemented as policy. And of course, as I mentioned last time, then aborting the development of vaccines for diseases that we know could outbreak at any time is also going to get people killed, because when the diseases inevitably outbreak, we won't be prepared. We'll be behind the curve, And just like when the first year or two of COVID, millions will die unnecessarily from a disease that we saw coming and we could have actually done something about in advance. Interestingly, because most other countries aren't as anti-science as the leaders are in our country, other countries will be much better prepared for a lot of these outbreaks. And so the deaths in future outbreaks in this scenario will be concentrated in the US. That is, will suffer the most, more than folks in China, more than folks in Japan, more than folks in Europe, because here we didn't respect the science of vaccination. We didn't mandate vaccines. We didn't develop vaccines in a timely manner. And so our population suffered and died. Our kids suffered and died. And, that's the situation you're looking at if you appoint Robert Kennedy Jr. as head of HHS. And he would be guilty through his policies and lack of actions. He would be guilty of mass murder, preventable mass murder, mass death. And anyone who aided and abetted his nomination would be guilty of abetting and aiding mass murder. So that's why, of all of the, say, appointments that Trump has put out for various agencies, his HHS appointment is the most alarming to me because it has the highest probability of causing mass death. Because other appointments, I think, have a much lower probability. These people, I may not agree with them. I may not think they're going to be very good at leading the agencies they're leading, but they have a much lower probability of causing mass death on a global scale or even on a national one. So that's my sort of conclusion to the last video. But I want to talk about why folks like Robert Kennedy Jr. become very popular these days. I have a feeling Kennedy Jr. is actually going to get appointed to this position only because of all of Trump's appointees, he seems to be the most popular of them because he's playing into this science skepticism, anti-science, junk science, fear-mongering sort of zeitgeist that we have now. So let me talk about the change in attitude towards science. 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s, science was revered. And scientists were revered in the United States. And we saw ourselves as a technologically superior nation, and we knew that we needed good science to maintain that status. And nowadays, it's just not the case. Science is feared, people are skeptical, people don't want to listen to scientists. So how did we get there? How did we get here, I should say, from there? And I think part of it is due to the fear is understandable. A lot of the inventions of science are terrifying or have terrifying potential. So I certainly understand the fear of scientific discovery. The skepticism is a little harder to wrap my head around. When I say skepticism, I mean people who just don't believe things that scientists say. But I think, having taught science for over 30 years to students who really didn't know a lot of science coming into my classes, I saw a lot of the skepticism and got to hear students talk about, where that attitude came from. And so, I have some real ideas about that. But first, let's start with the fear. It's understandable to be afraid of things that scientists might develop, and so kind of not want scientists to develop things. Science has developed nuclear weapons, and just about everyone is rightly terrified of nuclear weapons and the destruction they can wreak. To date, only the United States has used nuclear weapons on the battlefield. We dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan in World War II. And those nuclear bombs that we dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were very, very small, tiny, weak nuclear bombs compared to the ones we have today. Um, and even those two bombs, just two bombs, killed probably 160,000 people, wounded another couple 100,000, completely obliterated two cities in Japan, major real cities. So, and those bombs that we dropped on Japan are only about 1/1000th as powerful, maybe 1/100th to 1/1000th as powerful as the nuclear weapons we have today. Uh, and, that kind of destruction from a single small weapon is almost inconceivable and horrifically frightening. And the truth is, because we have so many nuclear weapons and our adversaries also have so many nuclear weapons, that if there were really a global thermonuclear war where different countries were dropping a bunch of nuclear weapons on other countries, it would have the potential to nearly extinguish entire countries, nearly extinguish human life on Earth, if not completely obliterate human life on Earth, depending on how many weapons were dropped. And, that's just terrifying and awful. Plus, death by nuclear weapon, depending on your range, how far you are from the detonation site, is either instantaneous or slow and horrifically painful. So this is just a terrifying thing, but yet it's the product of science, and so, being afraid of, scientific discovery when this is something scientists discovered and developed, is certainly a rational thing. Other things science has developed that either have caused human harm or have the potential to are things like the combustion engine, which all of us use whenever we drive or take a plane. Combustion engines were considered great things, revolutionized human transportation, the ease of it, the speed of it. But as we now know, the gases emitted from combustion engines, along with other forms of combustion, is contributing to the changing climate of the planet, the carbon dioxide released from those reactions. So that's been a very two-edged sword now. Social media, which is a product of internet technology, which was scientifically developed. In fact, it was originally developed by the U.S. military. Social media is, bad for kids, bad for their emotional and psychological development, as many studies are confirming these days. We've scientifically manipulated our food through highly processed foods and genetically engineered food. Using the tools of science, we've turned food that actually is good for you and healthy into food that's bad for you and contributes to diabetes and cancer and heart disease and strokes and obesity and is not so good for you. And more recently, we've developed techniques scientifically of artificial intelligence through computer science and genetic engineering through biology. And the jury's out on whether these things will ultimately turn out to be good or bad for us, but there's a real chance they could be bad for us in the long run. So I certainly understand people's fear of scientific discovery. Scientific inventions are often at least two-edged swords that can be used for good or for very bad, and some of them are just horrifically frightening, like nuclear weapons. So the fear is real, the fear is valid. A lot of times it seems like scientists just do what they can just because they can, not considering really whether it's going to be good for humanity or bad for humanity, or whether it's moral or immoral. Morality actually isn't officially a part of science, something we'll talk about later. Scientists are on journeys of discovery and invention, and sometimes they really don't take proper consideration of whether what they're discovering and inventing is going to be good for humanity or not. Okay, so fear is real, fear is justified. Let's talk about the skepticism. Kind of more interested in that part. People who just don't believe scientists when they say things. And some of that is due to the failures of science, right? Science hasn't been all success. There have been failures and things going a lot slower, paces of discovery in certain areas going a lot slower than I think a lot of people would like. One of the famous examples of that is cancer research. Scientists have been scientifically studying cancer for more than 100 years now. And we still don't have cures, reliable cures to advanced stage cancers, and even some early stage cancers or middle stage cancers we can't reliably cure. And the treatments are still varying degrees of horrific for a lot of cancers, even though they don't guarantee any kind of cure. So in the meantime, by the way, some interesting statistics from the National Institute of Health just came out last week that said that although the death rate from cancers are decreasing, that is, people are living longer with cancer, more people are getting cancer now than have ever gotten it in the United States, and in particular younger folks. More people in the 20 to 50 age range are getting cancer now than have ever gotten it before in the US. Now they're living longer because we do have more sophisticated treatments now. But the fact that more young people are actually getting diagnosed with cancer is alarming. So this is widely considered a failure of science. Scientists have been working on this. Medical researchers have been working on this problem for a long time. And they haven't found the solution yet. Now, I could go in scientifically, I could go into the reasons why that's true, but I'm not going to for the purpose of this podcast. But I will acknowledge the reality of that there are things that science has worked on, that it is problems that it's worked on, that it's failed to solve, failed to find explanations for, failed to find answers to. And a lot of these things are things that concern people a great deal. So some people are skeptical just because they point to failures of science. Well, you haven't cured cancer yet. True. So does that mean science doesn't work or scientists shouldn't be listened to? Yeah, I don't believe so. I mean, just really that some problems are more difficult to solve than others. But, I mean, does the fact that science has failed in certain areas or has not yet succeeded in certain areas, does that mean that it's useless or doesn't work? Well, no, because if you look at these things up here that people are afraid of, these are actually spectacular successes in science. Nuclear weapons, not from a social perspective, but from a purely scientific perspective. The fact that we were able to, from first principles, from the principles of physics, actually engineer and build nuclear weapons that work. These things work. That is, they're as destructive as they were intended to be. And they have the energy yield they were intended to have. They were meant to be ultimate weapons of destruction, enough to stop a war. And that's what they are. The fact that we were able to create those from first principles of science, from theory, even indicates how much science does work. If science really weren't true or valid, we wouldn't have been able to develop nuclear weapons from theory. Couldn't have happened. Because if the theory was wrong, if our ideas about how things work are wrong, our weapons wouldn't have worked, but our weapons did work. So, and they worked just the way they were intended to. with pretty much exactly the yields that were calculated, energy yields that were calculated in advance of the weapon. So that means that scientists are onto something there. Okay? It's not possible to accidentally build a nuclear weapon that works. Other things like the combustion engine, that works. The internet works. You know, you can engineer food and process it to make it very addictive and bad for people. Artificial intelligence is here and it's working a little bit too well. Genetic engineering is here and it works. We can re-engineer living things. We can get computers to do things that mimic human thought. So the fact that all these things work indicates that the science behind them, because they're all developments of science, the science behind them is valid. Because if it weren't, they wouldn't work. So you can't use the fact that science has not yet solved all our problems or figured everything out as a reason not to believe in it, because the things that science has figured out and the products of those ideas, are working, and in some cases even better than we ever imagined they could. So the bottom line is science as a process to gain knowledge and develop products is valid. We know that because it works in a lot of cases. There are some instances where it hasn't yet worked. That doesn't mean it will never work. It just means that some problems are harder to figure out than others. And we haven't come to, we don't know enough to have come to all of the solutions to all of our problems yet. But, someday we'll know more, and these things that we currently can't solve might be solved. Okay, so I wanted to address that form of skepticism. Just because you don't hit a home run every time you're at bat doesn't mean you're not a great baseball player. Pardon my sports analogies. Okay, so some people dismiss science for other reasons. For example, religious grounds. There are some religious folks who consider science to be anti-religious, against God, and they consider scientists to be either immoral or amoral, and so they don't want to have anything to do with their works, their immoral or amoral works, and they consider their work essentially blasphemy. So the folks who view science and religion as sort of at war with each other, and the folks who are religious who look at it that way, they often reject science out of hand just because they consider the science to be a violation of their religious beliefs and principles. And okay, I get that. Some people just don't like scientists because they think that they're smug and arrogant. And so they put them in their mental category of liberal intellectual elites or coastal intellectual elites. And, these are the people they felt have been denigrating them and disrespecting them. So with their attitudes, and so they just reject it because they don't want to listen to anyone who they feel puts them down or thinks less of them in some way. And again, I understand that too. And I've known my share of scientists, having been trained in science as a scientist and then having worked as a science teacher. I've certainly known my share of scientists, and some of them are smug and arrogant, but of course some religious folks are too, and there are people of all stripes who fall into that category, because smug and arrogant is just a certain type of person, and there are those types of people in every field, including science. I have noticed that some scientists get frustrated with people who aren't scientists, rejection of their ideas when they feel like, this person doesn't really understand my idea, and we'll get to more of that at the end here. But so some scientists are frustrated, and some scientists who are older and remember a time when science was more venerated in our society are just frustrated and sad and angry that they're no longer as respected a profession as they used to be. But definitely some people who are not in the science game, and even a few who are, are put off by scientists' attitudes sometimes. And they sort of, especially when they lump them into the coastal intellectual elite group. By the way, a lot of scientists I know are actually pretty politically conservative. So I wouldn't really lump most scientists I've met into the coastal liberal elite, because most of them aren't really that liberal. But I can see how from the outside it might look that way. So another one, and it goes along with this one above. A lot of folks have trouble understanding science. Science is complex. It requires you to not only learn about how science works, but about foundational knowledge in science and the interconnectedness of scientific principles, how physics and chemistry and biology are interconnected, and that requires a lot of learning, quite frankly, and some of that learning is very difficult because a lot of science deals with abstract concepts. That is, science has a lot of theories that revolve around things that we can't see. We can't experience them directly. For example, the atomic theory of matter, the basic theory of chemistry, deals with atoms and subatomic particles and chemicals and chemical bonds, and we can't see any of those things with our eyes. They're all way too small for us to see with our eyes. So science deals a lot with invisible worlds, and as a result, the theories of science often deal in abstractions, and there are a lot of people that have trouble with abstractions. That is, with descriptions of things they can't see. And ideas about how things behave that they can't observe. So because that's difficult for a lot of people, that sort of understanding, a lot of people just reject scientific ideas because they just can't understand them. So they can't see the logic of the idea. It's sort of like I was saying with Kennedy Jr., where his idea that it would be fine just to let people who want to get vaccinated, and let people who don't want to get vaccinated not get vaccinated, and let people vaccinate their kids if they want to and not vaccinate their kids if they don't. He thinks that's a good libertarian idea that gives people maximum freedom, and maybe so, but the scientific principles of immunity require that we require kids to get vaccinated. If we don't, we lose herd immunity, and a lot of people end up dying. So understanding that it's necessary to understand the principle of herd immunity and the spreading of germs and that kind of how germs actually spread and what stops the spread. It's ideas that are complex. And so if you don't understand those complex ideas, the libertarian view may sound good to you. It's like, yeah, freedom, great. But, in the theory of vaccination, if you give people too much freedom as to whether to take vaccines or not, the vaccines become less and less useful to the point where they might become very ineffective, even if the vaccines are good ones. So, there are definitely complex ideas in science. There are definitely abstract ideas in science. A lot of people do not understand these ideas. They haven't been well trained in science, in scientific principles, and so they sort of reflexively reject scientific ideas, or they substitute, not good sounding but non-scientific ideas that actually contradict the science, just because those ideas they can understand. Like, I can understand the concept of freedom of choice, but not the concept of herd immunity. And so freedom of choice sounds good to me, and herd immunity is like, what are you talking about? Yeah, I don't believe in that. So that comes back again to science education, and how well trained people are in scientific principles and the scientific way of thinking and understanding how things work. And then finally, there are some people who just deliberately spread misinformation, usually to sell something or to sell themselves. People who promote junk science, who mislead people about real science or ignore real science, and they promote fake science, essentially, not real science. And you can find a lot of these people, for example, in whenever you turn on your TV, you see examples of it. People promoting, beauty treatments, people promoting health treatments, people promoting various types of exercise or diet regimes for building muscle or losing weight or whatever. And some of those things actually are based on real science. A lot of them are not, and they're really just designed to try to sound like these people know what they're talking about, and to convince people to buy things, to basically separate people who don't have good knowledge in these areas from their money. So other times people, and I actually do believe that Kennedy Jr. is in this category, but I'm not sure because I don't know him. But some people promote junk science, not even for wealth. I mean, Kennedy's already wealthy. Not for personal wealth or gain, but to promote themselves as a way of aligning themselves with what they see as a popular attitude among the public, so that people will like them more or maybe vote for them or whatever, so that they can aggrandize themselves, so they can gain more power. Sometimes, by the way, it's about power, not money. That's true a lot in Washington. It's more of can be more of a power game than a money game. But in any case, some people deliberately mislead folks about science. And one of my biggest pet peeves here with the deliberate misleading is Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, who at one time was actually a real doctor and then ended up just hawking junk science, unproven, ineffective treatments for various things on his talk show. I like Oprah, but she's done a disservice to a lot of folks by introducing us to some real junk science and junk psychology people who've gone on to become very popular, and she gave them their original platform nationally. But Oz was one of the worst offenders, with just promoting one junk science thing after another. And the stuff he was promoting was not scientifically tested, and where it had been tested, it had been shown to be ineffective, and he would promote it anyway. So, and just really to sell ad time on his show and get people to buy things that weren't really going to help them and that they didn't need. So between all of these things, the scientific failures, the religious objections to a lot of what scientists do or how they do it, the what people perceive of as smug and arrogant attitudes of scientists, the fact that a lot of people just don't understand scientific principles, and so they just tend not to believe in what they can't understand, or can't see the logic of. And then people trying to fool other people deliberately by trying to pass junk science as real science. I can see how all those things collectively would make a lot of people skeptical. about science. So not really that surprising that skepticism is grown. But I'll tell you what's ironic is, my field is biology. And in my field of biology, these last few years, last 10 years, last 20 years, have been some of the most exciting times in the history of biology. Our pace of discovery, our ability to, change the way living things work has really accelerated. And it's been astounding. So astounding that I actually, for the first time, am hopeful that we will actually have cures for some of these diseases that have been very intractable, like cancers, Alzheimer's, etc., in the very near future. And when I say very near, I mean effective treatments within the next 5 or 10 years. And that's just because the pace of scientific discovery has accelerated so much. That was actually helped along by COVID and research done during the COVID epidemic, but also by other really important discoveries made recently. So I'm at least hopeful that if we don't, start ignoring scientists altogether, if we still let scientists do real science and still fund it, that at the very least, some of this will go away. That is, some of the problems that scientists have been working on and not solving for a lot of decades now will, in the next decade, actually get solved. Or at least we'll have much, much better treatments. Because the science in these areas has advanced so far, so fast. And believe it or not, artificial intelligence is actually helping with that advance. It's helped biologists a lot advance their fields, like find new drugs to treat diseases better, etc. We've got programs, artificial intelligence programs now, that actually can really speed up the process of drug development and treatment development for diseases. So again, as far as I'm concerned, the jury's still out on artificial intelligence, but at least the uses we put it to so far, most of them have been positive in outcome. So maybe that one won't end up as bad as some people fear it will. But anyway, so that's my take on science, fear, and skepticism right now. And I guess I finished up on why Robert Kennedy Jr. should not be the head of HHS. Okay, so that's it for the second podcast on science. The next one, I'm actually going to talk about the real process of science, how real science is done. And again, I'm going to prove to you that all of you have done it, even though you didn't think you were doing it. You were. Okay? So I will see you in the next podcast.